Hi class. I hope you've had a good week. I've been a bit sick, so I didn't get my video up as soon as I wanted to this week because I couldn't talk. Anyway, you're supposed to have read book 3 for this week, and book 3 is where Troilus and Cressida really start interacting the most. Not just letters, but actual physical interaction. What's kind of funny about this is we see their earliest encounter at Phoebus's house, and it's kind of this secret encounter behind the curtains and all that sort of thing. And then Cressida leaves, and Cressida is throughout sort of berating her uncle Pandarus and Troilus too, to an extent. She doesn't seem super eager to get caught up in any kind of relationship. At the same time that she worries about offending Troilus because he's so highly placed in Troy at the time. He's a prince, and so she kind of has to be careful. And Pandarus, of course, seems much more clearly interested in Troilus and Pandarus's own gain than he does in Cressida and her well-being. Anyway, and so we see this early encounter where Pandarus continually seems to be putting words in Cressida's mouth, trying to get her to be encouraging to Troilus. And I think what we see through this whole book is Cressida is just kind of run over a little bit her desires and her wishes. And instead, Pandarus and Troilus and their concerns are placed foremost. What we have towards the end of the book is an actual love scene between Troilus and Cressida, and we have like Troilus's love song, which is fairly well known. And it's one of those things where, we're singing about we don't want the morning to come too soon because we enjoy spending time with each other. And the love scene between Troilus and Cressida is not described in any great detail or anything. That was not as appropriate for this genre, though certainly we do have that occurring. There is a consummation of physical love here in this book. But what's really funny through this whole book is that Pandarus is just everywhere, including in the room while Troilus and Cressida are together, in what should be, we would think, some kind of private situation. And so it's just really, really funny, and that he's there, and he's supposed to be reading some old romance. But what we have here is what critics often refer to as, you have to be a critic to call it this, but an act of voyeurism, where Pandarus is more interested in watching and seeing the lovers together, almost like he's put them together for his own enjoyment and what he can get out of it, than he is with being concerned with either of their welfare, either Troilus in gaining his love or Cressida in staying modest and protected in what for her has to be a fairly at-risk position. And so this is a really kind of a strange story, and it's a strange way that it's told. And even then, when we turn it around again, we see that in the morning, once Troilus has left the bed, Pandarus kind of comes in and has his own intent, the story says, with his niece. And you can read that several different ways, whether it means he's just touching her inappropriately or he's doing his own thing. But it's certainly not appropriate by most standards, pretty much all standards. And so we just really see Cressida being taken advantage of in this story. And what's unique in this story about Cressida to other stories that are similar to this in the earlier versions of this story, including Il Filostrato, which is the direct source for Chaucer's story, is that Cressida in this story is actually much more portrayed as a victim. And she is portrayed as kind of this stronger character who's trying to get her own will and trying to be heard and just being ignored and taken advantage of by the male characters. And in the other versions of this story, Cressida is constantly being portrayed as evil, changeable, like she's constantly changing her mind. She can't possibly love in a committed way like Troilus can. And she's just basically portrayed kind of in an evil, sort of conniving, cunning way in the other stories. And that is not the case here. We kind of feel sorry for Cressida. And the other thing is that we should notice is that Pandarus and the narrator seem to have a lot in common. The narrator in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is kind of this naive sort of figure that we're supposed to take as not knowing that much, and so we trust him in the sense that he's just telling the stories as he hears them, and he's sorry if they're dirty or whatever. And that's kind of this sort of way of him not having to take responsibility for telling these dirty stories or something else, because that's the persona that he takes on. The narrator here seems to be taking on a similar persona early on, kind of this maybe naive in the ways of love, though learned in like book learning, what we would call book learning, scholarly academic knowledge he has, but naive in the ways of love. And that's how we seem to see the narrator. And of course, the narrator contributes his source to Lollius, which is just a made-up person. It's really, we know, Il Filostrato that is the source for this story, but he contributes, like I said, says that this is where the story is coming from. And what's funny, though, is that the narrator seems fascinated in watching what's going on between the two lovers. And that may seem odd since he's the narrator and he's just supposed to be telling the story. But the narrator is more of a character here, because when we look at narrators, one of the ways that we can characterize narrators is when the narrative voice actually breaks in and comments on things. And the narrator breaks in quite a bit to comment on what's happening in Troilus and Cressida. He doesn't just kind of stay in the background and tell the story. He's not kind of this third-person omniscient narrator in that sense. We have a much stronger character in this narrator, in the way he claims things about himself and the way that he comments on the action in the story. These are called meta-narrative moments, when the narrator himself stops the story to kind of have his input. And you see some of that in Book 3. You see it throughout, but you do also see it in Book 3. And in this way, it seems almost like the narrator and Pandarus have a lot in common. They're both really interested in what's going on in this story and kind of shaping the story to their own ends. And they both have kind of this voyeuristic side to them. And it's not supposed to be pleasing. You're not supposed to be taken in by this narrator or Pandarus. They're supposed to seem a little slimy and yucky. And I think that's because Chaucer, just kind of like what he does with the wife of Bath or the prioress, Chaucer seems to have a fairly sympathetic view of women. And so instead of portraying Cressida in the strongly negative ways that many of his predecessors have, he portrays her in a more sympathetic way in this story. And one of the ways he portrays her as more sympathetic is by making some of the male characters around her seem weaker, less complex, and a little slimy. Troilus in all of them is a slightly less complicated character. He's just the young lover, an ideal young lover in just about every way, very young, but kind of very adolescent in the way he approaches things, fairly immature, constantly swooning around, all those sorts of things. He's kind of like the very traditional, typical male courtly lover, and he's adept with his sword and at martial ability and all that sort of thing. But he acts very typically in that way, whereas Pandarus is a little he's a little more atypical villain, in the sense that he doesn't seem to be totally out and out a villain, but yet he really is, in the way that he seems to be just this go-between that's arranging a love match, but he's more than that, because he's almost taking Cressida to a scene that could potentially be, I wouldn't even say potentially, could be called by certain people rape. And yes, we do see some happiness between Troilus and Cressida, but Cressida doesn't seem to be responding all that positively towards her uncle's attentions later on in book 3. So this is kind of a disturbing part of the whole story. This is really the climax, literally, of the story, because from this point on, and of course it's right at the middle, the actual true middle of the story. I mean, we have 5 books, and so this is the actual literal center of the story, and this is when the action turns, and now we're headed back downhill. If you're familiar with the traditional kind of triangle of story plots, and so we're headed back downhill now. We're headed uphill at this point. Up to this point, but now we're headed downhill in terms of relationships to the resolution, and so it's a strange book. I do hope you all got something out of it. It's a more disturbing book. I like reading it less. And again, I think Troilus in his own way is maybe innocent, though he's certainly willing to take advantage of whatever Pandarus is willing to arrange for him. And Cressida, as much as possible, is also innocent. But, it is kind of a little bit of a creepy part of the story, and interesting, but also important in the way that Chaucer reshapes the story, because he makes Cressida much more sympathetic than other sources have portrayed her to be. So, we'll see you next week.